Upon finding a chalk cross drawn on the wall of her house after her mother-in-law's visit, the wife decided to follow her. What she discovered, no one could have anticipated. "So, Betty, how are you doing today?" Her pregnancy wasn't yet noticeable, but Lillian Black was already doting on her unborn grandchild. It was clear the baby was lucky to have such a devoted grandmother, and the daughter-in-law, a supportive mother-in-law. "I'm doing well, though I have to take more breaks at work. Thankfully, at our bank, they don't micromanage such things," Betty replied with a smile. "Yes, it seems like a good place for someone expecting, stable and calm," Lillian added. "True, but the pay is pretty low. And as for Gary, even though he's always traveling for work, it doesn't bring much benefit. Sure, he occasionally lands a big project, but not often. And you know what his official salary is like. I've told him he needs to look for a better job. After all, I need him around for me and the baby," Betty sighed. "Oh, Betty, he's an architect. It's not that easy to find another position. Besides, he's a man, the provider. It's good that he's working hard for the family and isn't lazy. You'll see, his efforts will pay off eventually," her mother-in-law reassured her. "I can't even remember the last time Gary stayed home for at least a week. And this is my first pregnancy. Do you know how scary it is? I keep having all these strange dreams, anxious ones." Betty chose not to share the specifics of her nightmares, where she often saw her husband holding a peculiar doll. It wore a little coat and socks and seemed to try to speak, but Gary would silence it as if he were choking it. Such disturbing dreams. Could it be a sign they were having a daughter? Perhaps that was the connection. But why did her husband look so menacing in them? "Betty, why are you so gloomy?" "You're not responding to me at all," Lillian called out, sounding slightly hurt. "Oh, I'm sorry, I was just lost in thought," the young woman apologized, feeling awkward. Her mother-in-law was always so supportive, visiting her, inviting her over. Yet Betty felt like she wasn't giving Lillian the attention she deserved. "So, as I was saying, when I was expecting Gary, I used to talk to him even before he was born. I read him stories, he especially loved ones about animals. It's strange, really, that he became an architect. When he was little, up until about 5, he loved climbing trees. He was like a real-life Mowgli," Lillian said. "Do you have any photos from that time? In all the pictures I've seen of Gary in the album, he's already 7 or older. You'd never guess he was like Mowgli. He always looked so clean, neat, either focused or smiling mischievously," Betty replied, surprised. Lillian's expression suddenly darkened. She mumbled something under her breath, and then reluctantly said, "No, unfortunately, none of those photos survived." Her mother-in-law looked so upset that Betty decided not to press further. It seemed the albums had been lost under unfortunate circumstances. Lillian continued to reassure Betty for a while, telling her how she, too, had been scared before giving birth, but it all went quickly and smoothly. She barely had time to worry. Still, there was something puzzling about Lillian's story. If her account was true, Gary had drastically changed when he started school. He had gone from a wild, animal-loving child to someone who adored building blocks and the exact sciences. When his mother suggested they get a pet, he had refused outright. Betty already knew her husband wasn't fond of animals. He always said he was allergic. It was impossible to drag him into the woods to pick mushrooms. He had no interest in fishing or any outdoor activities. The couch, his computer, the TV, and technical books for work were his closest companions during the rare times he was actually home. "I've even signed up for a parenting course," Betty admitted with a sigh. "I'm afraid I'll let the baby down, that I won't be a good mom." "Why would you think that? You're kind, gentle, and calm. Who else would make a better mother than you? You have everything you need to give the baby a great start, a complete family. Both parents work, and I'll help as well," Lillian reassured her. "And how did you manage to turn a wild child into such a homebody?" Betty asked. "Oh, Gary just changed on his own. I can't even really remember how it happened," Lillian replied. For someone who had been so enthusiastic about discussing parenting techniques earlier, Lillian now seemed oddly downcast. Betty couldn't help but notice some inconsistencies in her stories. Sometimes she described Gary as lively and even rambunctious, and other times as cunning and reserved. Betty chose not to voice these observations. She saw Lillian as almost a second mother and didn't want to correct her or point out any errors or inconsistencies in her memories. Maybe one day, when Betty is older, she herself won't recall certain details or might mix things up. It's not such a big deal. Besides, people change over the years. Gary probably just grew out of his childhood habits. Not all kids keep the same personality traits for life. A few more weeks passed. Gary was still away on his trip, though he had promised to come back any day now. "Your business trip is dragging on. I miss you so much." Betty tried to sound neutral, but a tinge of frustration slipped into her voice. She thought she heard a woman's laugh in the background. It wasn't loud, but distinct enough to make her suspicious. "What's that sound? Is there someone with you?" she asked, her suspicion slipping into her tone. "Baby, come on. Pregnant women get strange ideas, but this? Seriously? What woman?" "I'm alone in the hotel room. The TV's on, and these walls are thin. You're probably just hearing the neighbors," Gary replied defensively. "Then show me your whole room on a video call," Betty demanded. "No way. I'm not giving in to this nonsense. That's just insulting. What have I ever done to make you doubt me? I'm here working my butt off to earn money for us, and instead of being grateful, I get accusations," he snapped, clearly annoyed. Betty hung up and, to her surprise, found herself in tears. That night, the strange dream came back, the one where Gary pressed his hand over the mouth of the little doll-like girl. And now, the odd phone call only deepened her unease. She was almost certain she had heard a woman laughing in the background, not completely, but almost. Later that day, Lillian came over. Betty tried to share her suspicions, but her mother-in-law barely listened. She seemed anxious, repeating over and over that Gary would be home soon. When Betty happened to glance outside to the veranda, she caught sight of something peculiar. Lillian was drawing a strange cross-like symbol on the wall with chalk. It was shaped like an X. "Won't you catch a cold out here?" Betty called out after waiting a moment, wanting to avoid being spotted right away. It struck her as odd that Lillian, who usually took great precautions against the cold, was standing outside in a thin sweater in the chilly early spring weather. Normally, she would have worn a jacket, maybe even a hat, just to air out a room. "Oh, I didn't see you there," Lillian exclaimed, quickly shifting her position to block the freshly drawn symbol from view. Betty pretended not to notice. What's going on with her? Could she have gotten into something like esotericism? What's the point of this? Does she want to stir up trouble between me and Gary? Or maybe she's trying to help us reconcile. I thought I knew her well, Betty thought, feeling a heaviness settle in her chest. Her grandmother used to tell her stories about people who dabbled in superstition or the occult, how they often pretended to be kind and sweet but secretly worked behind the scenes to cause harm. Betty tried to dismiss these thoughts as nonsense, but she couldn't shake the question of why Lillian had drawn that X-like cross. It clearly wasn't a Christian one to ward off evil spirits. The day dragged on, and Betty barely made it to the evening. Gary had a strict rule about calls. She was only allowed to call him between 7 and 9 p.m. on weekends, as though she had to schedule an appointment with her own husband. "So, Betty, what's the latest? Still convinced there's some invisible giggling woman in my hotel room? Or is it something crazier this time?" Gary teased with a smirk. The way he spoke to her, as if she were delusional, stung. She didn't even want to bring up the cross Lillian had drawn that morning, but the thought gnawed at her. Eventually, she worked up the courage. "Hey, has your mom ever been into esotericism or anything like that?" she asked hesitantly. "Oh, here we go again," Gary groaned. "First it's that creepy dream about the doll, then you're convinced I've got a mistress, and now my mom's in the mix. What's next?" You gonna call her a witch? I get that you're pregnant, but there's gotta be a limit to this nonsense. Betty winced. I feel bad even saying it. You know I like your mom. But this morning, she was acting so weird, she barely even listened to me. And then there was that cross. Do you really think I'm imagining this? She asked, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. She truly felt awful accusing Lillian, a woman who had never hurt a fly. I'm sure it's just your nerves, Gary said more gently. Once the baby's here, you'll feel better. Look, I'll be back soon. I promise I'll listen to whatever's bothering you then. Just wait for me, okay? But please, don't upset my mom. She doesn't deserve that. Betty nodded and promised. But the unease didn't go away. Gary was right, she shouldn't upset Lillian. But if she just followed her a little, discreetly, it wouldn't hurt anyone. And maybe then she could finally put her mind at ease. Betty glanced at her car in the garage and frowned. Lillian would recognize it immediately. To avoid raising suspicion, she decided to rent a car instead. She felt ridiculous, like she was playing some amateur spy game. Betty scolded herself for getting caught up in this nonsense, but the idea wouldn't leave her alone. A few days later, she took unpaid leave from work and made up her mind. If Lillian truly had any strange behavior, she would notice it. And if she didn't, which seemed more likely, she could finally let it go and move on. That day, her mother-in-law took a taxi and headed not just anywhere, but to a prison. Now that was a surprise. No one noticed a petite, blue-eyed young woman with a pale, oval face sitting quietly in a rental car. Betty sank into her seat and watched as her tall, even powerfully built mother-in-law greeted a young man at the prison gates. The man was broad-shouldered, in his mid-30s, with brown eyes, and he looked at Lillian with visible irritation. He clearly wasn't happy to see her. No, this definitely isn't some secret romance with a convict. I should be ashamed such an idea even crossed my mind, Betty thought. The taxi waited for Lillian outside the gates. She climbed in with the mysterious man, and the two of them drove off together. Betty kept following at a safe distance, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. Suddenly, her phone vibrated. The sound startled her so much that she jumped. Quickly, she answered the call while keeping an eye on the taxi, careful not to lose it. To her surprise, it was Lillian on the other end of the line. Betty, hello, dear. How are you today? I'm fine, just fine, Betty replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm just out running errands, picking up groceries. She realized the background noise of the road would give her away, but hoped Lillian wouldn't notice. I actually need your help at the dacha, Lillian said, her tone oddly strange, not exactly insincere, but somehow fake. Could you come by around lunchtime? What's going on? Betty asked, genuinely curious. I'll explain when you get here. This wasn't like Lillian at all. She was usually very direct and not prone to vague explanations. Betty realized immediately her mother-in-law was trying to lure her away from the house for some reason. Wanting to test her theory, she agreed to come at first, but quickly added, "Oh no, wait. I just remembered I have to head straight to work after shopping. I won't be home until evening. Totally slipped my mind." Betty figured that if this excuse worked, Lillian's real intention was indeed to keep her away from the house. Well, if that's the case, of course, dear, Lillian replied, her voice suddenly sounding more enthusiastic. She repeatedly confirmed that Betty would be at work until evening, then cheerfully said she'd manage the dacha tasks herself. Fortunately, Betty knew a shortcut and managed to get home ahead of Lillian. She parked the car her mother-in-law would recognize in its usual spot, but left the rented car farther away, near a neighbor's driveway, so it wouldn't draw suspicion. Then she slipped inside the house, locked the door behind her, and waited, hidden. No sooner had 10 minutes passed than a taxi pulled up. Betty's heart raced, and her legs felt like they had turned to stone. She nearly collapsed, but managed to steady herself. What would she say if Lillian and her strange companion walked into the kitchen? Hiding in the room wasn't an option, she wouldn't be able to see anything from there. It's fine. I'll just say I wasn't feeling well and came back early. After all, I'm pregnant, Betty thought, trying to calm herself. But to her surprise, Lillian and the man she called Richard didn't come inside. Instead, Lillian went to the shed, fetched a tool, and handed Richard a hammer. He struck the wall exactly where the strange symbol had been drawn. The plaster fell away easily, revealing the metal door of a safe hidden underneath. There, all set. I'll send the taxi away, and you go ahead and open it, Richard, Lillian said. Richard fiddled with the safe, cracking it open much faster than Betty expected. You shouldn't have paid so much. It's a simple mechanism, anyone could have done it, Richard grumbled. Well, that's for me to decide. Lillian's tone was impatient as she swung the safe door open. Forgetting caution, Betty leaned out of the slightly open window. What is it? Money? Jewelry, she wondered. To her shock, Lillian pulled out a doll. The dream was coming true, and yet none of it made sense. Although Lillian had her back to the window, Betty could hear the disappointment in her voice as she thanked Richard for breaking into the safe. Lillian ran her hands over the doll, inspecting it from all angles. Then, looking dejected, she placed the toy back inside the safe and said, "Now we need to patch everything up so no one notices. My daughter-in-law could come back soon." While Richard hurriedly sealed the safe with a quick-drying material, Lillian swept up the debris and dumped it into an old bucket left over from a past renovation. Betty recalled how her husband had refused to throw the buckets away, claiming they might still be useful for fixing the veranda, or perhaps he was just too lazy to deal with them. She was never quite sure. Betty stayed frozen in place, not daring to move until Lillian and her strange companion had left. Once the coast was clear, she examined the bucket of debris. Nothing interesting, just chunks of plaster. What was that all about? The mysteries keep piling up, Betty thought. It was only then that she realized she'd stepped out onto the unheated veranda in thin socks. She'd deliberately removed her shoes earlier to avoid making any noise. Something sharp had embedded itself in her foot. It didn't hurt, but it was uncomfortable. Betty pulled off her sock and balanced on one foot, inspecting the tiny object stuck to the fabric. It was a flash drive, light brown in color. Small enough to have gone unnoticed, it must have fallen out when Lillian retrieved the doll. Its slim profile and wood-like color matched the floorboards perfectly, making it easy to overlook. Lillian and her companion must have been in such a rush they didn't notice it. Or perhaps they hadn't even known it was there. It must have fallen out of the doll's clothing, and they missed it in their hurry, thought Betty. Without hesitating, she inserted the flash drive into her laptop and was relieved to find it undamaged. What she saw on the screen made her blood run cold. It was a video of her own husband, Gary, sitting behind the wheel of a car. In the footage, he confessed to hitting a man with his car and killing him before driving away from the scene. Betty couldn't yet understand how this flash drive had ended up in the concealed safe. Judging by Gary's demeanor, he likely had no idea it existed, otherwise, he surely would have destroyed such damning evidence. But that raised an even bigger question: whose house were they living in? Betty had always thought the home belonged to Gary's family. That's what Lillian had told her. But now, she wasn't sure she could trust either Gary or his mother. Clearly, much had been hidden from her. The safe must have been installed by the house's previous owner. But where was that person now? And how had Lillian learned about this hidden secret? Betty realized she knew very little about her husband and his mother. She decided to play it safe and made multiple copies of the flash drive, just in case something happened to her. Later that evening, Gary called. "Baby, I'm coming home tomorrow." Excited? "Oh. You could have warned me, I need time to prepare." Gary revealed he'd be arriving early in the morning. "Mom said you already went grocery shopping." "She must have sensed it, huh?" Gary said with a chuckle. Betty winced. "I lied to her, just like she lied to me. I spent the whole day tailing her, and now I'm more confused than ever," she thought bitterly. But aloud, she mumbled something vague and noncommittal. The fridge was nearly empty, forcing her to make a late-night trip to the supermarket, where everything cost more. She had no choice. For now, she couldn't risk telling Gary about her day of spying. First, she needed to figure out her next move. Something about Gary's voice unsettled her. It sounded distant, fake. His coldness toward her had started about a year ago, well before her pregnancy, so that wasn't the reason. After buying groceries and preparing a meal, Betty was utterly exhausted. Her back ached, and all she wanted was sleep, but the image of that doll kept haunting her. It reminded her of one her grandmother used to have. When Betty was little, she had once climbed up to the top shelf of a wardrobe and accidentally broken the buttons on the doll's coat. Her grandmother had punished her with a belt. Childhood had never been sweet for Betty. She was a girl nobody dreamed of having, quite literally, a child no one wanted. Her mother had dumped her on her grandmother, who clearly hadn't been thrilled about it. The grandmother had made sure Betty was fed, dressed, and kept from playing outside too long. But beyond that, she offered nothing. "Grandma, let's talk about something." "I'm so bored," the little girl pleaded. "Go on, let your mother call you from out of town if you're so desperate for company, cuckoo." She found herself some fool just like her. Probably drinking together, the both of them. Haven't sent a penny in 2 months. Why'd she even bother having a kid with those genes, huh? Grandma spat. Betty knew her father was a kind but weak man. He had an enduring friendship with the bottle, though he worked a steady job. Quiet drinking wasn't his style, he'd always take it to the next level. On his work trips, he'd find the shortest layover at a train station, rush out to buy alcohol, and get drunk with strangers. Inevitably, he'd spend the night at the station, and a day later, call home asking for money to buy a return ticket. By then, he'd usually be wearing someone else's old hat and coat, his documents long gone. If he was lucky, he hadn't gotten into a fight. Otherwise, he'd wind up in the hospital. Betty's mother had always believed it was her burden to bear. She was convinced children needed to grow up in a complete family. To her, the fact that she only saw her daughter once or twice a year didn't mean anything. As long as she and her husband stayed married, everything was fine. The child must be happy. Betty's mother was sharp-tongued, tall, thin, with piercing blue eyes and dark hair perpetually shadowed by tired circles. But Grandma was wrong about one thing: her mother despised alcohol and wouldn't touch it. Not that it mattered. Grandma never missed an opportunity to criticize her, whether on the phone or during the rare visits. Betty's grandpa worked tirelessly, holding down both his main job and odd side jobs, trying to smooth over conflicts and balance the family dynamic. But his efforts were futile. Eventually, Betty's parents stopped visiting altogether, skipping years at a time. When Betty was 12, she accidentally discovered why her grandmother hated her mother so much and why she was so cold to Betty herself. One night, Betty woke up to see light spilling from beneath the kitchen door. Low voices murmured beyond it. She had never heard her grandpa argue with Grandma before. He was the peacemaker, always smoothing conflicts with gifts, neutrality, and a refusal to acknowledge the chaos. "Take Betty with you, I can't do this anymore." When she was little, at least she was cute. Now she's talking back to me. "When I married you, I didn't sign up for this." "I've had enough with Angela, your precious, brainless daughter," Grandma croaked, her voice sharp and grating. "But you yourself said you couldn't have children." "You were happy to have Angela," Grandpa said, surprised. "Happy with Angela, happy with Angela. I hope she rots in hell, and Betty with her, and you too. I don't need to pretend anymore. I've been your wife long enough, and now you're out of work. Angela and her husband don't send us money, so why should I put up with any of this? Welcome to reality, old man. You're just a useless pensioner now, shedding sawdust, so stop acting like you're the head of this family. I'm done tolerating any of you." Grandma hissed venomously. Betty clamped her hands over her ears in horror. So that was it. This wasn't her real grandmother, and she didn't love her at all. That's why she'd been so furious when Betty tore the buttons off the doll's coat. That's why she relentlessly tore into Betty's mother. "Mom, why didn't you tell me Grandma isn't my real grandmother? That she hates me, you, and Grandpa?" Betty blurted during her mother's next visit, recounting the conversation she had overheard. "This is it," Betty thought. "Mom will understand everything now, and she'll take me away. She'll save me. Let Grandma and Grandpa sort themselves out." But her mother only sighed wearily. "Betty, don't tell anyone about this again. Every family has its secrets. Yes, she's not my real mother, but she does love me." "How can that be?" "She's always calling you names, saying we'll all end up living in the gutter. I don't want to live with her." "If you won't take me, I'll ask to go to an orphanage," Betty said, resorting to emotional blackmail. "Don't disgrace our family, Betty. I've done everything to make sure you have both a mother and a father. And now you want to upset Grandma?" Betty noticed her mom said nothing about herself. It seemed she wouldn't care if her daughter willingly went away somewhere. Instead, her mother sternly scolded Betty. "What's wrong with you? You're just spoiled. You get fed, clothed, and live in warmth. You even have music lessons paid for. Other kids out there get beaten like rented mules, and they still respect their elders. But you've gotten too big for your boots." "Mom, I'm not a piglet," Betty whispered tearfully. What are you talking about?" Her mom's voice sharpened. She hated nothing more than when Betty got philosophical. She believed overthinking led nowhere good and was convinced that intellectuals were just unfinished fools. "I'm telling you, I don't want to live with people who hate me. I don't want to take food or drink or clothes from you either. At least in the orphanage, they'll be indifferent to me," the girl said. No one took her words seriously. Her mom was still sucking up to Grandma. Grandpa blew his nose loudly and went to his room at the first sign of a fight. Her dad didn't even remember he had a daughter. All he said was that alcohol helped him feel human for once. And he felt like everyone was just using him. Work hard, pull your weight, with no life in between. Betty was already entering adolescence. She was a smart girl and knew that she could never drag the adults out of the madhouse where everyone had already chosen their role. It was useless to tell her dad that all his earnings went toward treating his addiction and dealing with its consequences. Her mom firmly believed that she could save the family. Grandma thought she had sacrificed enough for the sake of maintaining the status of a married woman and living in the capital. Grandpa was in his own world. As long as Betty could remember, he had always been gloomy and grumbling, saying the younger generation would grow up ungrateful, no matter how much you invested in them. Betty didn't end up going to the orphanage. For a while, she dreamed of running across the street on a busy highway, but she felt sorry for the driver who would hit her. She knew people got sent to jail for that. She'd seen it on a show. Her dad soon drank himself into oblivion and stopped working altogether. Her mom was pulling the load for both of them. Though, that had always been the case. Now, however, she was paying even more for the illusion of a complete family than she had before. When Grandpa retired, he lost the ability to hide from Grandma when needed. Not long after, he had a heart attack after yet another tea session where they were sorting things out. In the hospital, someone had opened the window all night. He developed pneumonia from it and died. Betty was 18 at the time, and she was thankful Grandpa had lived long enough to see her reach adulthood. She felt like a tightly wound spring. She dreamed of escaping the family madhouse and starting a life on her own from scratch. Mom and Grandma were at war over the inheritance, throwing awful accusations and even curses at each other. Her dad, having finally quit drinking, left for a younger woman and quietly started his life over. Betty got a job at a bank, first as a promoter, then as a consultant, to avoid spending too much time in the apartment where Mom and Grandma were constantly fighting. The stronger one was supposed to win, and the loser was meant to slink away. But the strength of their battle was more or less the same. There was no end in sight. At the bank, the girl was promised that if she worked well, they would cover her distance learning. She seized the opportunity. She knew she had to work, no one would feed or clothe her any longer, and there was no money for education. Her mom and grandma continued their war with unhealthy glee. It was clear that some dark forces had taken over them, and they were not opposed to it. What? You spent your whole life with that fool in glasses, now you're almost an old woman, and he's run off with a younger woman. You've always been an idiot, and now I can say it, Grandma taunted. At least I loved my husband. You never had a child. And you never loved my father. He just took you in. And who are you? A simple village woman, stupid and greedy. Get out of my father's house. Betty's mom screamed at her stepmother, whom she had suddenly stopped loving. As a result of the huge arguments, they swapped the apartment for 2 tiny one-room flats with terrible repairs. Betty chose to live with her mom because Grandma no longer wanted to see those 2 traitors, as she called Betty and her mother. In reality, Betty hadn't said or done anything bad to her grandmother. She had even been somewhat attached to her. After all, Grandma had raised and fed her, and it was hard to ask for much more. It was only as a teenager that she had been an idealist, but as she grew up, she understood her situation. Her case wasn't even the worst. Her mom sank into constant depression, threatening to take her own life, and kept tabs on Betty's father through acquaintances on social media. Betty's dad, a soulless, rosy little man, lived his life in peace, even having 2 more children. After long court battles, her mom finally won most of their former joint apartment and traded it for a room in a dormitory in the province for Betty. Sweetie, I've done everything for you. You have your own space, and I need peace, her mom said. Betty was grateful to her. She didn't stop loving her mom just because she was a peculiar person. Betty was beginning to understand that all people have some quirks, but they see themselves as completely normal. She kept seeing her mom and helping her as much as she could. Her mom became very ill and needed constant care. Meanwhile, Betty was making some career progress, though modest, but she had a good reputation at the bank. She was considered reliable and hardworking. Sometimes, Betty even visited her grandmother. Grandma remained cold and distant, saying that she would leave the inheritance to her younger sister anyway. Betty turned to her grandmother and said, "Grandma, I already understand that we're not really your family. You raised me, though. I wish I could see you sometimes." Betty desperately needed some form of familial connection. Like a dog, she begged for attention from anyone who would give it. She even called her father. But he said he had worked hard enough, and it was now harmful for him to interact with his ex-wife and her entourage. By entourage, he meant Betty. In the end, she managed to establish some kind of relationship with her mom, though her mom often behaved like a spoiled teenager, getting upset with Betty for reasons she couldn't understand. Betty was also able to maintain at least neutral relations with her grandmother, congratulating her on major holidays and offering help if needed. Betty had no illusions anymore. She had been given this family, not another one. And she worked with what she had. Both her mother and grandmother died in the same year. Her mother had cancer, and her grandmother suffered a heart attack on the anniversary of her husband's death. In both their homes, Betty found albums with pictures of their husbands. It seemed that, in their own way, both her mother and grandmother had loved their husbands. Even though the love was unhealthy, it still commanded respect. Betty, however, had hardly experienced any love herself, only tiny droplets of it. Grandma kept her promise. It turned out she had given her apartment to Betty's younger sister while she was still alive. But Betty never regretted trying to treat her grandmother humanely. She decided for herself that she would never marry, given the miserable fate of women in her family. What could she offer a husband or children anyway? In order for something to pour out of a vessel, it first has to be filled. She was only 22. Betty traded her room in the dormitory and her mother's small apartment for a somewhat decent one-bedroom apartment in a slightly more comfortable area. She prepared herself to live as an old maid for the rest of her life. She even adopted 2 cats. Betty didn't feel bitter or scared at the thought of never having children, a husband, or any real family. Her fate was simply that way. Living alone was still better than creating an illusion of a complete family. At least it would be honest. But Betty didn't want to be alone. She was just very weak, afraid to fall in love. She knew that the slightest betrayal, infidelity, would sweep away whatever remained of her life, even if it was modestly built. Yet, at night, she would cry when she saw one of her former classmates with a stroller. She longed to have children, but she couldn't force herself to trust people, especially men. Still, at 24, she fell in love. The feeling came suddenly, unexpectedly. It was a warm autumn day, the so-called Indian summer, and Betty was walking in the park. Suddenly, the rain started pouring down. People quickly opened colorful umbrellas and rushed off in different directions, but she stayed, alone in the downpour, almost frozen in place. The cold wind made the rain lash against her skin, the drops stinging her delicate face. Betty looked around, seeing no shelter nearby, so she slowly trudged down the avenue. She'd get soaked, so what? Even if she caught a cold and died, who would care? Suddenly, Betty heard a snap. Then, she looked up and noticed a large red spot above her head. After a moment, she saw a tall brunette with brown eyes, who was looking at her and smiling. "Do you like the rain? Shouldn't you have opened your umbrella?" he asked. "I don't even know if I like it. It just started, and I started walking," Betty said, feeling confused. She stared at the slightly tanned, charming stranger with a strong chin, low forehead, and prominent features. He was wearing an elegant gray coat. He looked like a prince, well, very much so. But Betty knew that in her fairy tale, there was no place for princes. She had decided that for herself when she was 18. Yet now, some sort of magnetic, animal-like charm from this stranger seemed to melt her resolve to live alone for the rest of her life. She even felt a threat to her small, gray, but otherwise reliable little world. "You're quite amusing. Not flirting with me, even though it's obvious you don't have anyone." "My name is Gary," the man said. The young man, probably around 30, was clearly used to female attention and wasn't shy about projecting it. "I really don't have time to chat with you. I'm not afraid of the rain, but you're scaring me. Besides, I need to go to work," she said, trying to step away from under the red umbrella. But somehow, the stranger easily caught up with her every time, making up for 3 or 4 of her steps in just one of his. "And where do you work?" Gary asked. "In a psychiatric hospital," Betty said, hoping to shake him off. The man laughed. "I like your sense of humor. At least tell me your name?" Betty tried not to look back. Why is he sticking around? "I'm not one of those bright, flashy beauties that men chase after," she thought with a tinge of regret that, indeed, she didn't fit that description. Right now, she wished she could be that beautiful girl, so that Gary wouldn't look at her so shamelessly and joyfully. Instead, he'd be nervous, respectful, awestruck, and all that. He seemed to have given up when Betty reached the bus stop and jumped on the bus. How surprised she was when, inside the bus, she saw Gary, looking at her and smiling. He was very charming, even with his wet hair from the rain. She couldn't take her eyes off him. To get rid of him, Betty gave him a fake number. But even that didn't work. He immediately called her and said, "It's not good to start a relationship with a lie. We have no relationship and never will. Why do you even think I'm single?" "I have a fiancé, and I'm getting married soon," Betty lied desperately. She didn't even know if she wanted him to leave her life forever or stay until the end of her days. "Listen, I won't give up. You don't have anyone, don't make things up. I know women well." He didn't chase her out of the bus, but the next day, he was waiting for her in the park. This time, Gary had come in a car. Betty agreed to have coffee with him, but in the end, she pulled out her wallet. "I won't owe you anything," she said, looking at him defiantly, as if daring him to try and beat her. "Listen, you're really amusing. Maybe I do need a wife like you. I don't remember the last time I smiled and was so surprised." Usually, women are so boring, Gary said. Betty couldn't remember exactly when they became a couple, not just in his imagination, but in reality. Gary always behaved as though they were already together. And one day, Betty simply gave in to his persistence. She sold her apartment and moved into his house. It took her much longer to get to work, but for the sake of family happiness, she was willing to endure it. Her relationship with her mother-in-law was good. She constantly took care of Betty. Not a day went by without Lillian calling. But it didn't annoy Betty, it made her happy. She had longed for close people, and her mother-in-law's care felt genuine, especially in contrast to the lack of love Betty had experienced her whole life. Her relationship with her husband was good. Betty was always happy to see him when he came home, and she missed him in between. They dreamed together of becoming parents. He was interested in her well-being, always caring, and never rude to her. He didn't come home very often, but Betty accepted it. The separations didn't feel so hard when the reunions were filled with joy. She didn't want to meddle in his life, didn't snoop through his phone, and was content with things as they were. That's how they lived for 3 years. The cooling off from Gary began about a year ago. Betty tried to bring back the tenderness they once had, but her husband no longer smiled, no longer looked at her like she was family, and became distant. And that same year, she got pregnant. Now it turns out that Lillian has a secret from her, and it's unclear whether Gary even needs her anymore. And on top of that, she's expecting a child. Betty felt trapped, confused, and cried all night. In the morning, she woke up to the sound of her husband's and mother-in-law's voices. Apparently, Gary had arrived but chose not to wake her up. She didn't even hear when Lillian came in, probably after speaking with her son. It's actually good Betty is still asleep. Son, Oscar Matthews has come out of his coma. And I still haven't found any compromising material he was hiding on you. It could destroy your life. You know what to do about it, don't you? Lillian asked, whispering. Mom, I'll go to the clinic myself, find out what's going on. Are you sure you didn't slip up and say anything to Betty? Gary asked. Son, I'm not young, but I'm not senile either, Lillian replied. I'm your mother, not your enemy. I hope so, Gary sighed. But his voice betrayed clear doubt. Betty glanced at the clock. It was already around 11. She had slept in for a long time. She waited another 20 minutes and then started to stir. She pretended she had just woken up. Oh, you're up? Well, you need more rest. I've already set the table, Lillian said, cheerfully. Lillian brought a pie and some snacks with her. It was actually quite timely because Betty hadn't had the chance to prepare much, she had been too upset. So, are you happy to see your husband? Sleeping in until noon? Gary asked, trying to sound cheerful, but his gaze remained cold. Betty noticed that her husband didn't ask how she was feeling. That made her uncomfortable. What would happen next if he was already acting like she was a stranger? The whole day felt chaotic. They talked about insignificant things, but everyone had their own thoughts. Lillian's eyes darted around, and Gary didn't even seem to see Betty. She bitterly thought that apart from the baby, she probably had no family left. Once again, it was just her against the world. It's okay, we'll get through this, she whispered to her baby before falling asleep. Betty continued to cry in her sleep. It hurt that her husband had gone to sleep in another room, as if she had become repulsive to him and he couldn't even bother to explain himself. Normally, Gary would say something like, "Sorry, I'm tired, I want to sleep," but this time, he didn't even think she was worth an explanation. Betty could hear his phone vibrating through the wall. He had set it to silent, but he didn't realize she could still hear the faint vibrations. He was obviously texting someone. Betty even heard soft chuckles from Gary. He seemed to be enjoying himself texting someone he was happy with, but it wasn't her. The next day, she had another day off. Betty decided to go to the hospital. Betty, what are you doing here? We haven't seen each other since school, the on-duty nurse, Sandra, said in surprise. Sandra, I need to know if anyone has recently come out of a coma. Don't be surprised, it's an old family matter. I'll tell you the whole story some other time, Betty replied. All right, I'll try, but I work in a different department, said Sandra, a short woman with red hair. Later that same day, Sandra called Betty back. Yes, a man named Oscar, 32 years old, came out of a coma. He's a gamekeeper. He sustained a head injury a few years ago. Does that help? It does, very much. I owe you one. Can you arrange a meeting with him? Betty asked hesitantly. Listen, it's a tricky situation. Oscar's being cared for by one of the nurses, Priscilla. She's completely obsessed with him. She used to take care of him herself, but now that he's awake, she's either jealous or sees everyone as an enemy. So, this won't be easy, Sandra confessed. I hope you didn't have a romantic relationship with this patient? A romance with Oscar? No. That would be a bit much. I just want to clarify something for family reasons, Betty said. Sandra promised to help but emphasized that if anything went wrong, it wasn't her fault. If Priscilla attacked Betty, Sandra would be staying out of it. However, she would provide a white coat as a disguise so that Betty wouldn't draw attention to herself. Several years ago, Gary and I got married and moved here. Why are my husband and mother-in-law so concerned about Oscar waking up? Betty thought to herself, deciding that it would be pointless to ask directly. The next day, she had work, but she decided she would try to talk to the patient who had woken up. She would just walk into his room, introduce herself, and ask if he had any connection to her husband and mother-in-law. But before she could reach the room, she heard voices. Looking through the slightly ajar door, Betty saw a pale, short blonde man and a voluptuous brunette, both engaged in an animated conversation. Oscar, I'm so glad you woke up. I was so scared. I barely managed to make sure they didn't turn off your life support. And I was right to fight for you. Priscilla confessed her love to the gamekeeper. She told him she knew from the first moment that he was her destiny. Thank you. I know you spent a big part of your salary on my treatment. Once I get back on my feet, I'll pay you back, Oscar promised. It doesn't matter. The most important thing is finding out who attacked you. What if that person comes back and tries to finish what they started? Priscilla continued, stroking his hair. I didn't catch the car's license plate, but the confession is kept at our old house with Linda. By the way, why doesn't she visit? I've called her, but she doesn't answer, Oscar sighed. Silly, I'm the only one who matters to you. Linda already divorced you and sold the house. New people live there now. By the way, if you're curious, your ex-wife has already remarried. You're not of any interest to her anymore, Priscilla said, her eyes flashing with jealousy. Betty decided not to listen to any more of the nurse's maddeningly affectionate words. Sandra had told her that Priscilla had a tough life. Her only adult son had died in a kayaking accident, and she had grown up in an orphanage. One could understand why she had poured all her unspent love onto Oscar. But Betty needed to find out the truth. Oscar had mentioned the house, the files on the flash drive, Linda, and her mother-in-law had once mentioned that Linda was the former owner of the house. But Lillian had made it sound as if the house had been bought a long time ago. Now it was clear. This was a recent story. So, does this mean my husband ran someone over? I need to find out everything, Betty thought, her heart pounding. With determination, she walked into the room. She blurted out her full name, her husband's name, their address, and then asked, You were talking about my husband with Priscilla. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but it just happened. Oscar reacted strangely. He shielded himself with his arm as if Betty were about to hit him. Don't come near me. You've already ruined my life. Your whole family is just as bad as each other. You even changed into a hospital staff uniform, sneaked up, and listened in on conversations, Oscar said, his voice filled with resentment. I told you so. So this is what happened. Your husband must have sent her to finish the job, Priscilla screamed. Then she jumped up from her seat and shoved Betty out of the room. "Don't you dare come near him again, or it'll be the end for you and your whole family." Betty was relieved that at least she wasn't handed over to security. But later that evening, she had to have a conversation with her mother-in-law. The cuckoo from the old clock sounded, making Betty jump. The mechanical voice announced that evening had arrived. She had forgotten that her husband had wound it up when he came home. The old house seemed alive again, but that wasn't a good sign. Before, when it had been silent, it felt better. Lillian, to whom Betty had revealed everything she had learned, nervously stirred sugar into her cup for the 100th time. In fact, she had simply forgotten to put it in, so there was nothing to stir, but Betty decided not to mention it. They had far more serious matters to discuss. "Betty, why do you need to know this? Isn't it enough to understand that I'm not your enemy? I'm not good at lying and making things up, so it's better if you forget your questions. Trust me." Lillian forced the words out and reminded Betty that she shouldn't be getting nervous at her age. "It's too late. I'm already nervous. I can't calm down. My whole life is falling apart. I don't want to pretend everything is fine," Betty said. Sigh. "Fine. I see there's no other way. But know this, I've always treated you well, and I continue to do so," Lillian sighed. Betty barely believed her now, but she nodded. She just needed to know the truth, no matter what it was. "Well, Gary is not my biological son, though I raised him. You understand, his father was a wild man, violent. I couldn't leave him. I was afraid Sean would kill me and the child. So, I decided to send him to an orphanage." He was 5 then. Lillian winced and grabbed her heart. After catching her breath, she continued. "To be honest, I was also afraid that Gary would take after his father. It's one thing to be married to a monster, and another to be his mother. So, that's what I was most afraid of, if I'm being honest," Lillian said. "I understand," Betty sighed, thinking of her own family. "So, I hid for about 2 years. From my ex-husband and from myself. But then my son started appearing in my dreams. And just as that happened, my husband was killed by his drinking buddies. So, I inherited the house. And I decided to bring Gary back. I couldn't forgive myself for giving him away. The poor child didn't do anything wrong," Lillian continued. Betty didn't interrupt, she just nodded silently. Lillian continued to explain that instead of her Gary, one of the vindictive caretakers had slipped her another boy from an even more troubled family, where both parents drank. The fact was, by that time, Lillian's biological son had already been adopted and given a new name and surname. The caretaker decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. On the one hand, to punish the negligent mother who had given birth to a wild man's child and then, scared of bad genes and a life of poverty, had abandoned the boy. On the other hand, Gary was a difficult, introverted boy who lagged behind his peers, and his facial features resembled the other child's. So, the spiteful caretaker said, "Here's your son, madam." And since the child was also named Gary, the mother initially didn't realize. His hair had darkened, he had grown, his character had changed, but that was understandable. Children go through many changes at that age. Besides, life in an orphanage wasn't sweet. "So, you never doubted that he was your son? You never felt it?" Betty asked. She remembered how Lillian had described her husband up to the age of 5, and then after that, it was like she was talking about 2 different people. Even Betty had noticed it, but dismissed it as memory lapses. No, I never thought about it. The guilt weighed me down. I did everything for Gary. He caught up with his peers and stopped being so scared. He didn't remember me at all. But I didn't see it as a problem. After all, kids make up all sorts of things. I only found out he wasn't my son when Gary was climbing on a construction site with some boys, fell, and ended up in intensive care. He needed a blood transfusion, and mine didn't match. That's when everything came to light, Lillian explained. The truth clearly wasn't easy for her. She seemed to have aged 10 years. She hunched over, her eyes grew dull. But didn't you want to get your son back? You could have raised both of them. Well, I mean, it's not really my place to say, Betty suddenly realized. It wasn't her place to judge. They say you should walk a mile in someone's shoes before you judge them. Oh, of course, I wanted to, but he had already been adopted. By a simple couple, not the worst people. But I was foolish and didn't want any publicity. If I had brought it up, people would have found out I gave my son away to an orphanage and that Gary wasn't my real son. So, I just watched Oscar. That was the name his new parents gave my flesh and blood, but I didn't tell him I was his mother. Wait, you're saying your son is the gamekeeper who just woke up from a coma? Betty guessed. Yes, that's what I'm getting to. I lived a quiet life, resigned to the fact that I was raising someone else's child and had planned to just keep an eye on my own son, thinking it was my penance for old sins. But Gary, out of nowhere, hit an innocent man on the road and killed him. And guess what? Did he call the police? No. He tried to hide the body in the forest and bury it. That's when Oscar found him, made Gary record a confession, hid the flash drive in a safe, and put the doll there as a decoy. And the rest, you know, Lillian sighed. Almost everything. But who beat up your real son? So badly that Oscar survived only by a miracle? Betty asked. Gary and his henchmen. They were scared. He's not a bad person. I tried to raise him right. But look how things turned out, Lillian quietly cried. Betty hugged her mother-in-law. Now she understood the full picture. Linda, Oscar's wife, who never really loved her husband, had gladly sold the house, even though it was illegal. Lillian had been trying to find dirt, but not to help Gary escape justice, but because she feared that if Oscar woke up, Gary would try to kill him. She wanted to protect her biological son while ensuring that he wouldn't become a conscious murderer. It was one thing to accidentally hit someone, but quite another to finish off a man who had just woken up from a coma. I'm sorry, Lillian, Betty sighed as the woman stopped crying. What for? What do you have to apologize for? Lillian asked. I thought badly of you. I should have spoken to you earlier, but I was scared, the daughter-in-law admitted. Before Lillian could answer that everything was fine, Betty suddenly felt unwell from the stress. An ambulance had to be called. She was taken to the maternity ward to preserve her pregnancy. Lillian, horrified, wondered if she had done something wrong again. She had told the truth, as requested, but everything still turned out badly. No matter what she did, it never seemed right. She had tried all her life to do everything as best as she could, but it always ended up the same way. Lillian cried in helplessness, clutching a small brown plastic rectangle in her hands. The same flash drive that Betty had given her. Her daughter-in-law trusted her, and now she had to act in a way that wouldn't harm anyone. Mom, why are you so upset about Betty? I've already fallen out of love with her. Yeah, she caught my attention for a while, but Linda will be more interesting. A real beauty. Tall, graceful, elegant, her hair as black as pitch, and her eyes sparkling. And she's so bold. We mesh much better. I'll introduce you to her soon. Gary thought he was comforting his mother with this news. What are you saying, son? Have you completely lost your conscience? His mother tried to calm him down. But Gary could only talk about his new great love and how they needed to come up with a way to eliminate the gamekeeper. You know, if I find any dirt on you, I'll never give it to you. And if something happens to Oscar, I won't care that you're my son. Lillian snapped in anger. Gary didn't like that at all. When his mother went to the bathroom, he rummaged through her purse for a long time. He found the flash drive and immediately destroyed it. Ah, it's a good thing my mother is so simple. She spilled everything. There's a conspiracy against me. I've had enough of all these lectures. She was never an authority for Gary. He tolerated her because she was useful. Sometimes, he even thought that he loved her, but only when she petted him. Meanwhile, Priscilla hid her beloved in the remote house of her late grandfather. She helped him escape right after the wife of that scoundrel who hit Oscar dared to show up in the hospital room. She was terrified of losing her beloved. The escape was caught on the security cameras. She hadn't thought of that, and Priscilla was fired. But there were small savings, and saving her beloved was far more important. Priscilla felt like enemies were right on her heels, and to some extent, she was right. The real danger, however, did not come from Betty, whom she had immediately and completely despised. Betty, at that time, was struggling with the loss of her unborn child in the early stages of pregnancy. She knew the doctors had done everything they could. A miracle didn't happen. The doll appeared again in her dreams. This time, it was broken and thrown away. Betty cried. She somehow felt sure that she would have had a daughter. Her husband was of no support to her. He outright said that he had fallen for someone else, a bright, fiery beauty. He had finally found a worthy life. Betty suggested simply getting a divorce. Her mother-in-law told her that the flash drive had gone missing from her purse after the conversation with Gary. Lillian supported her as best as she could, but it didn't make it easier for Betty. She tried not to tell her mother-in-law that she had decided to discharge herself from the hospital. Lillian would have said that she was still too weak, which was true, but being there was unbearable. She felt like she was no longer needed. Again. For some reason, Betty remembered her childhood dream of crossing a very busy road without a pedestrian crossing. Not that she consciously wanted to end her life, it was just so painful, and childhood memories resurfaced. She spotted a large bus. She thought that there would be many witnesses, and they would confirm that the driver wasn't at fault. The screeching of brakes could already be heard. The driver was yelling something obscene, when suddenly, some force literally yanked her away a second before Betty could throw herself under the wheels. She looked up and saw Richard, the same one who had helped her mother-in-law break into the safe. She thought she was delirious. Betty woke up at home. It really was Richard. Her mother-in-law explained that he wasn't a criminal at all, quite the opposite. The thieves had tried to bribe him to help them break into safes, but he had refused. As a result, they set him up in revenge. Richard's real profession was ensuring security, testing new safe models, and recommending improvements. "I don't even know how to thank you," Betty said to him 3 months later, when she had finally fully recovered. "But, you know, I can recommend you to my boss," she suggested. To Betty's surprise, her boss, who wasn't very hopeful about the idea, asked Richard to open a safe. When Richard effortlessly cracked a high-security model, the boss hired him as a consultant. His criminal record didn't raise any red flags. The security chief had checked his background through his own channels and learned about the conflict with the criminals. The hardest part for Lillian was deciding to hand over a copy of the recording to the police. She felt sorry for Gary, but she knew it had to be done. When Gary was arrested, Oscar appeared. And Lillian finally confessed that she was his real mother. She had to tell Gary as well. He was very upset but admitted to the crime and even apologized to his mother. Lillian was relieved that her son wasn't as bad a person as she had feared. "Mom, listen, don't worry about him. Gary didn't kill anyone. I just wanted to scare him. The homeless guy really would have died if I hadn't dug him out. He was only wounded. But he's fine now," Oscar reassured her. "How's that? Can we help him with something?" Lillian asked, relieved. Now Gary wasn't a murderer. "I got him a job. Everything's fine with him. I talked to him recently," Oscar said, calming his mother down. In the end, Gary only received a suspended sentence. But it turned out that Linda had been introduced to him for a reason. She had been selling information from his company to competitors. So, Gary lost both the fiery woman and the money. Even their old house, Lillian gave to Oscar. She thought it was fair. "Betty, listen, I've been thinking. Let's start over." In the new circumstances, a 2-bedroom apartment for his ex-wife seemed like luxury. It was a decent start. Gary definitely remembered that Betty had loved him, but she couldn't just forget everything so easily. Sorry, the train's already left. When I needed support, it wasn't there. And my love left with our child, Betty said. So, you've decided to live alone? Gary smirked. Betty didn't want to answer him. 2 years had passed, and she had truly fallen in love with Richard. She was certain that this time it wasn't just a fantasy. Lillian was preparing for 2 weddings. Betty was marrying Richard, and her biological son was marrying Priscilla. He figured there was no point in looking for something better. After all, Priscilla had done so much for him, and Betty and Priscilla were expecting. They became friends over this shared joy. Lillian promised she wouldn't spill the secret about Gary. Her adopted son wasn't a bad person, but he was jealous and dangerous. This time, the mother kept her promise. It was easy because Gary, once again, had found the love of his life and had moved to another city. So Lillian peacefully attended both weddings and prepared to become a grandmother twice over. Whether they were boys or girls, she already loved her future grandchildren, not distinguishing between biological or not. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.